In search of a majority, an address. I'm supposed to speak this evening on the goals of American society as they involve minority rights, but what I'm really going to do is to invite you to join me in a series of speculations. Some of them are dangerous, some of them painful, all of them are reckless. It seems to me that before we can begin to speak of minority rights in this country, we've got to make some attempt to isolate or to define the majority. Presumably, the society in which we live is an expression, in some way, of the majority will. But it is not so easy to locate this majority. The moment one attempts to define this majority, one is faced with several conundrums. Majority is not an expression of numbers, of numerical strength, for example. You may far outnumber your opposition and not be able to impose your will on them, or even to modify the rigor with which they impose their will on you, i.e., the Negroes in South Africa or in some counties, some sections of the American South. You may have beneath your hand all the apparatus of power, political, military, state, and still be unable to use these things to achieve your ends, which is a problem faced by de Gaulle in Algeria, and the problem which faced Eisenhower, when largely because of his own inaction, he was forced to send paratroopers into Little Rock. Again, the most trenchant observers of the scene in the South, those who were in battle there, feel that the Southern mobs are not an expression of the Southern majority will. Their impression is that these mobs fill, so to speak, a moral vacuum, and that the people who form these mobs would be very happy to be released from their pain and their ignorance if someone arrived to show them the way. I would be inclined to agree with this, simply from what we know of human nature. It is not by impression that people wish to become worse. They really wish to become better, but very often do not know how. Most people assume the position, in a way, of the Jews in Egypt who really wished to get to the Promised Land, but were afraid of the rigors of the journey, and, of course, before you embark on a journey, the terrors of whatever may overtake you on that journey live in the imagination and paralyze you. It was through Moses, according to legend, that they discovered, by undertaking this journey, how much they could endure. These speculations have led me a little bit ahead of myself. I suppose it can be said that there was a time in this country when an entity existed which could be called the majority, let's say a class, for the lack of a better word, which created the standards by which the country lived, or which created the standards to which the country aspired. I'm referring, or have in mind, perhaps somewhat arbitrarily, the aristocracies of Virginia and New England. These were mainly of Anglo-Saxon stock, and they created what Henry James was referred to, not very much later, as our Anglo-American heritage, or Anglo-American connections. Now, at no time did these men ever form anything resembling a popular majority. Their importance was that they kept alive and they bore witness to two elements of a man's life which are not greatly respected among us now. Number one, the social forms, called manners, which prevent us from rubbing too abrasively against one another, and number two, the interior life, or the life of the mind. These things were important, these things were realities for them, and no matter how rough-hewn or dark the country was then, it is important to remember that this was also the time when people sat up in log cabins, studying very hard by lamplight or candlelight. That they were better educated than we are now can be proved by comparing the political speeches of that time with those of our own day. Now, what I have been trying to suggest in all this is that the only useful definition of the word majority does not refer to numbers, and it does not refer to power. It refers to influence. Someone said, and said it very accurately, that what is honored in a country is cultivated there. If we apply this touchstone to American life, we can scarcely fail to arrive at a very grim view of it. But I think we have to look grim facts in the face, because if we don't, we can never hope to change them. These vanished aristocracies, these vanished standard bearers, had several limitations, and not the least of these limitations was the fact that their standards were essentially nostalgic. They referred to a past condition. They referred to the achievements, the laborious achievements, of a stratified society, and what was evolving in America had nothing to do with the past. So inevitably what happened, putting it far too simply, was that the old forms gave way before the European tidal wave, gave way before the rush of Italians, Greeks, Spaniards, Irishmen, Poles, Parisians, Norwegians, Swedes, Danes, wandering Jews from every nation under heaven, Turks, Armenians, Lithuanians, Japanese, Chinese, and Indians. Everybody was here, suddenly, in the melting pot, as we like to say, but without any intention of being melted. They were here because they had wanted to leave wherever they had been, and they were here to make their lives, and achieve their futures, and to establish a new identity. I doubt if history has ever seen such a spectacle, such a conglomeration of hopes, fears, and desires. I suggest also that they presented a problem for the Puritan God who had never heard of them and of whom they had never heard. Almost always, as they arrived, they took their places as a minority because their influence was so slight and because it was their necessity to make themselves over in the image of their new and unformed country. There were no longer any universally accepted forms of standards, and since all the roads to the achievement of an identity had vanished, the problem of status in American life became, and it remains today, acute. In a way, status became a kind of substitute for identity, and because money and the things money can buy is a universally accepted symbol here of status, we're often condemned as materialists. In fact, we're much closer to being metaphysical because nobody has ever expected from things the miracles that we expect. Now, I think it will be taken for granted that the Irish, the Swedish, the Danes, etc., who came here can no longer be considered in any serious way as minorities. And the question of anti-Semitism presents too many special features to be profitably discussed here tonight. The American minorities can be placed on a kind of color wheel. For example, when we think of the American boy, we don't usually think of a Spanish, Turkish, a Greek, or a Mexican type, still less of an Oriental type. We usually think of someone who's kind of a cross between the Teuton and the Celt, and I think it is interesting to consider what this image suggests. Outrageous as this image is in most cases, it is a national self-image. It is an image which suggests hard work and good, clean fun and chastity and piety and success. It leaves out of account, of course, most of the people in the country and most of the facts of life, and there's not much point in discussing those virtues it suggests, which are mainly honored in the breach. The point is that it has almost nothing to do with what or who an American really is. It has nothing to do with what life is. Beneath this bland, this conquer image, a great many unadmitted despairs and confusions, and anguish and unadmitted crimes and failures hide. To speak in my own person, as a member of the nation's most oppressed minority, the oldest oppressed minority, I want to suggest most seriously that before we can do it very much in a way of clear thinking or clean doing as relates to the minority in this country, we must first crack the American image and find out and deal with what it hides. We cannot discuss the state of our minorities until we first have some sense of what we are, who we are, what our goals are, and what we take life to be. The question is not what we can do now, but for the hypothetical Mexican, the hypothetical Negro. The question is what we really want out of life, for ourselves what we think is real. Now, I think there is a very good reason why the Negro in this country has been treated for such a long time in such a cruel way, and some of the reasons are economic and some of them are political. We have discussed these reasons without ever coming to any kind of resolution for a very long time. Some of them are social, and these reasons are somewhat more important because they have to do with our social panic, with our fear of losing status. This really amounts sometimes to a kind of social paranoia. One cannot afford to lose status on this peculiar ladder, for the prevailing notion of American life seems to involve a kind of rung-by-rung ascension to some hideously desirable state. If this is one's concept of life, obviously one cannot afford to slip back one rung. When one slips back not a rung but back into chaos and no longer knows who he is. And this reason, this fear, suggests to me one of the real reasons for the set of the Negro in this country. In a way, the Negro tells us where the bottom is, because he is there, and where he is, beneath us, we know where the limits are and how far we must not fall. We must not fall beneath him. We must never allow ourselves to fall that low, and I'm not trying to be cynical or sardonic. I think if one examines the myths which have proliferated in this country concerning the Negro, one discovers beneath these myths a kind of sleeping terror of some condition which we refuse to imagine. In a way, if the Negro were not here, we might be forced to deal within ourselves, in our own personalities, with all those vices and all those conundrums, and all those mysteries which we have invested the Negro race. Uncle Tom is, for example, if he's called uncle, a kind of saint. He's there, he endures, he will forgive us, and this is a key to that image. But if he's not uncle, if he's merely Tom, he's danger to everybody. He will wreak havoc on the countryside. When he is Uncle Tom, he has no sex. When he's Tom, he does. And this obviously says much more about the people who invented this myth than it does about the people who are the object of it. If you have been watching television lately, I think that is unendurably clear in the faces of those screaming people in the South, who are quite incapable of telling you what it is they are afraid of. They do not really know what it is they are afraid of, but they know that they are afraid of something, and they are so frightened that they are nearly out of their minds. And this same fear obtains on one level or another, to varying degrees, throughout the entire country. We would never, never allow Negroes to starve, to grow bitter, and to die in ghettos all over the country, if he were not driven by some nameless fear that has nothing to do with Negroes. We would never victimize, as we do, children whose only crime is color, and keep them, as we put it, in their place. We wouldn't drive Negroes mad as we do by accepting them in ballparks and on concert stages, but not in our homes and not in our neighborhoods and not in our churches. It is only too clear that even with the most malevolent will in the world, Negroes can never manage to achieve 1/10 of the harm which we fear. No, it has everything to do with ourselves, and this is one of the reasons that for all these generations we have disguised this problem in the most incredible jargon. One of the reasons we are so fond of sociological reports and research and investigational committees is because they hide something. As long as we can deal with a Negro as a kind of statistic, as something to be manipulated, something to be fled from, or something to be given something to, there is nothing we can avoid, and what we can avoid is what we really, really mean to us. The question that still ends these discussions is an extraordinary question. Would you let your sister marry one? The question, by the way, depends on several extraordinary assumptions. First of all, it assumes, if I may say so, that I want to marry your sister, and it also assumes that if I asked your sister to marry me, she would immediately say yes. There is no reason to make either of these assumptions, which are clearly irrational, and the key to why these assumptions are held is not to be found by asking Negroes. The key to why these assumptions are held has something to do with some insecurity in the people who hold them. It is only, after all, too clear that everyone born is going to have a rather difficult time getting through its life. It is only too clear that people fall in love according to some principle that we have not as yet been able to define, to discover, or to isolate, and that marriage depends entirely on the two people involved. So that this objection does not hold water. It certainly is not justification for segregated schools or for ghettos or for mobs. I suggest that the role of the Negro in American life has something to do with our own concept of what God is, and from my point of view, this concept is not big enough. It has got to be made of much bigger than it is, because God is, after all, not anybody's toy. To be with God is really to be involved with some enormous, overwhelming desire and joy and power which you cannot control, which controls you. I conceive of my own life as a journey towards something I do not understand, which in the going toward makes me better. I conceive of God, in fact, as a means of liberation and not a means to control others. Love does not begin and end the way we seem to think it does. Love is a battle, love is a war, love is a growing up. No one in the world, in the entire world, knows Americans better, or odd as this may sound, loves them more than the American Negro. This is because he has had to watch you, outwit you, deal with you, and bear you, and sometimes even bleed and die with you, ever since you got here, that is, since both of us, black and white, got here. And this is a wedding. Whether I like you or not, or whether you like you or not, we are bound together forever. We're part of each other. What is happening to every Negro in the country at any time is also happening to you. There's no way around this. I'm suggesting that these walls, these artificial walls, which have been up so long to protect us from something we fear, must come down. I think that what we really have to do is to create a country in which there are no minorities. For the first time in the story of the world, the one thing that all Americans have in common is that they have no other identity apart from the identity which is being achieved on this continent. This is not the English necessity, or the Chinese necessity, or the French necessity, but they are born into a framework which allows them their identity. The necessity of Americans to achieve an identity is a historical and a present personal fact, and this is the connection between you and me. This brings me back, in a way, to where I started. I said that we couldn't talk about minorities until we had talked about majorities, and I also said that majorities had nothing to do with numbers or with power, but with influence, with moral influence, and I want to suggest this. That the majority for which everyone is seeking, which must reassess and release us from our past and deal with the present and create standards worthy of what a man may be, this majority is you. No one else can do it. The world is before you, and you need not take it or leave it as it was when you came in.